The courtroom was silent as Mrs. Victoria Whitman, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, stood before Judge Marcus Carter. Her polished white blouse and pearl necklace gleamed under the fluorescent lights. With an air of indignation, she began recounting her ordeal. "Your Honor," she started, her voice tinged with anger, "I invited Mr. James Wilson, a handyman, to my home last Tuesday to fix a leaky faucet. While I was busy in my office upstairs, I heard the refrigerator door open. When I came down, I caught him red-handed, Your Honor, helping himself to a water bottle from my freezer. And that's not all. I later discovered that items worth over $2,000 were missing from my home." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People exchanged glances, some frowning, others shaking their heads. Mr. James Wilson sat quietly at the defendant's table, his head held high, but his hands clasped tightly together. His simple, neatly pressed shirt and jeans contrasted sharply with Mrs. Whitman's elegant attire. Judge Carter raised a hand, silencing the room. "Mrs. Whitman, please continue." "Your Honor," she said, her voice rising, "I trusted him. I let him into my home, and he took advantage of my kindness. I demand justice." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but remained silent, his dark brown eyes fixed on the judge. Judge Carter nodded and turned to James. "Mr. Wilson, you'll have your turn to speak. For now, let's hear Mrs. Whitman's full account." Mrs. Whitman's expression grew more determined as she went on. "I keep my house in perfect order, Your Honor. I'm meticulous about my belongings. That's how I immediately noticed the missing items. Jewelry, some cash, and even a pair of my husband's vintage cufflinks. Gone." Judge Carter leaned forward, his face unreadable. "Did you witness Mr. Wilson taking these items?" "Well, no," Mrs. Whitman admitted, her voice faltering slightly. "But who else could it have been? He was the only one in the house." The judge raised an eyebrow. "I see. Do you have any evidence, perhaps security footage or an inventory log, to support your claim?" Mrs. Whitman's cheeks flushed. "I didn't think I'd need to record someone stealing from me, Your Honor. I trusted him." The tension in the room was palpable. James's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Mrs. Whitman's growing frustration. The judge turned to the audience. "We'll proceed with fairness and listen to all sides. Mr. Wilson, you will have the opportunity to respond shortly." The murmurs quieted as Mrs. Whitman continued. "It's not just about the money, Your Honor. It's about the betrayal. People like him." She paused, catching herself. "I mean, I expect better when I hire someone to work in my home." Judge Carter's gaze sharpened, but he remained composed. "Mrs. Whitman, this court values facts over assumptions. Please keep your statements focused." Mrs. Whitman's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. I just want the truth to come out." The judge nodded. "We all do, Mrs. Whitman. Let us proceed." He motioned for James to prepare to speak. The courtroom settled, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood up, his hands trembling slightly. His voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor," he began, "I went to Mrs. Whitman's house to fix her faucet, as she said. It was a hot day, and I was very thirsty. I waited for her to come downstairs so I could ask for some water, but she didn't show up. I saw a bottle of water in her freezer, so I took it. I didn't think it would be a problem." He paused, glancing at the judge before continuing. "As for the missing items, I swear I didn't take anything. I've been a handyman for over 10 years, and I've never stolen from anyone. I'm here to do honest work, not to cause trouble." Judge Carter nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mrs. Whitman, do you have any evidence to support your claims?" Mrs. Whitman huffed. "Of course I do. I took an inventory of my belongings, and several items are missing. Plus, I have a witness who saw him acting suspiciously." The judge raised an eyebrow. "We'll hear from the witness shortly." James added, "Your Honor, I've worked in this community for years. I've fixed faucets, painted walls, and built porches. My reputation speaks for itself. I would never jeopardize my work for a few dollars." The judge regarded him thoughtfully. "Reputation is important, Mr. Wilson. Do you have any character witnesses who can vouch for you?" James nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I've asked 2 of my clients to testify on my behalf. They've known me for years." The courtroom's tension remained, but a sense of balance began to emerge. Judge Carter turned to the bailiff. "Let's proceed with the testimonies." The next moments would determine the course of the case, and everyone in the room felt the weight of what was at stake. As Mrs. Whitman's accusations continued to unfold, the courtroom's tension remained palpable. The first witness, Mrs. Eleanor Price, a neighbor of the Whitmans, was called to the stand. She was a frail woman, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. As she adjusted herself at the witness table, her voice was clear but filled with hesitation, as though uncertain of her role in this complex situation. "Your Honor," she began, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, "I've lived next door to Mrs. Whitman for 15 years. On the day in question, I was sitting in my living room when I saw Mr. Wilson leaving her house. He had his toolbox with him, but he looked rushed, almost nervous. He glanced around before getting into his truck and driving off." Judge Carter took in her words carefully, his eyes fixed on her. "Did you see him take anything from the house?" he asked, his voice steady but probing. Mrs. Price shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "No, Your Honor, but I thought his behavior was suspicious. He was moving quickly, almost like he was trying to get away. I didn't see anything else." James's expression remained calm, though his jaw tightened slightly. He stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I often have to leave jobs quickly. It's not unusual for me to be in a hurry to get to my next client. I wasn't nervous, I was just focused on finishing my day's work and moving on to the next task." The judge nodded thoughtfully, but Mrs. Price's testimony seemed to have made an impact. The courtroom murmured as the witness left the stand, and the next one was called. Mr. Robert Davis, a longtime client of James, stood confidently when called upon. He was a tall man, his demeanor friendly and open. "Your Honor," he said, his voice warm, "I've known James for over 8 years. He's worked on my house numerous times, plumbing, repairs, and even some renovations. I've always found him to be trustworthy and reliable." Judge Carter leaned forward, his expression neutral. "And have you ever had any concerns about Mr. Wilson's honesty?" "No, Your Honor. In fact, I trust him so much that I've given him keys to my house on several occasions when I've been out of town. He's never once given me cause to believe that anything went missing," Mr. Davis replied without hesitation. The contrast between Mrs. Price's testimony and Mr. Davis's was stark. The neighbor's claims of suspicion seemed unsubstantiated, while Mr. Davis's glowing endorsement painted a picture of a man who had built a reputation for honesty over many years. The courtroom became more still, the air thick with the weight of the testimonies. James's defense was gaining strength. Mrs. Whitman's case seemed to falter with every witness who spoke. Judge Carter raised his gavel and called for a brief recess. The weight of the moment hung over everyone as they filed out of the courtroom for a few minutes of quiet. Outside, the world felt distant, like the calm before the storm, but the tension was undeniable. Each word, each testimony, seemed to carve a path toward an uncertain conclusion. Would the court see past Mrs. Whitman's accusations and the doubts they raised? Or would the pressure of her claims create an irreversible judgment? As the break ended and the courtroom filled again, the focus turned back to the judge, who was prepared to continue with the difficult task of weighing the evidence. The courtroom buzzed once more, the next steps becoming ever more crucial. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Mrs. Whitman, who had once been poised and confident, now sat rigid in her seat. Her frustration was evident in the way her fingers tapped impatiently on the wooden table. The mounting doubts surrounding her case seemed to fuel her anger, and as the testimony unfolded, her control began to slip. Judge Carter, ever calm and measured, addressed the courtroom. "We've heard from both sides, and I must remind everyone that this trial is about facts, not emotions. Each party has presented their case, and we must continue to respect the process." Mrs. Whitman's voice cracked through the silence as she stood, unable to contain herself any longer. "Your Honor," she burst out, "how can you not see what's happening here? He's guilty. I know he is. And you're just going to let him walk free? This is outrageous." Her outburst reverberated through the room, causing heads to turn in shock. Judge Carter's brow furrowed, but his tone remained even. "Mrs. Whitman, I understand your frustration. However, we must base our decision on the evidence presented, not on assumptions or emotion. I ask that you sit down and allow the court to proceed." But Mrs. Whitman was beyond reason now, her face flushed with a mix of anger and desperation. "You're defending him. You're just like him," she shouted, her voice rising. "You don't want to believe me because he's one of your own." The courtroom went silent. The words hung in the air, thick with accusation and contempt. James's eyes widened in disbelief, and the tension in the room reached a boiling point. He had remained calm throughout the trial, but this personal attack was too much. He stood up, his hands clenched at his sides, but Judge Carter quickly raised his hand to quiet the room. "Mrs. Whitman," the judge said, his voice low but firm, "this court will not tolerate personal attacks or unsubstantiated accusations. I ask you to remain respectful and refrain from making baseless statements." But Mrs. Whitman's fury was uncontrollable. She reached down and, in a moment of pure frustration, removed her sandal and hurled it toward the judge. It sailed through the air, landing with a solid thud on the judge's desk, causing gasps to ripple through the courtroom. Chaos erupted. The bailiffs rushed forward to restrain Mrs. Whitman, who struggled against them, her protests echoing off the walls. Her outburst had thrown the entire court into disarray. The tension that had been building since the trial began finally erupted in a way no one had anticipated. Judge Carter, though startled, remained composed. "Order in the court!" he called out, his voice booming over the chaos. The bailiffs managed to escort Mrs. Whitman out of the courtroom, her cries growing fainter as the doors swung shut behind her. With Mrs. Whitman removed, the court fell into a stunned silence. The judge took a moment to regain his composure before addressing the courtroom again. "This behavior is unacceptable," he stated, his voice calm but resolute. "Let this be a reminder that this is a place for justice, not for personal vendettas. I will not tolerate such disruptions." As the room quieted, the judge called for a brief recess to allow the proceedings to regain their balance. James, his hands still trembling, took a deep breath. He had known the case was difficult, but the events of the past few minutes had shaken him. How could the truth have been so easily overshadowed by anger and suspicion? When the court reconvened, it did so with a somber atmosphere. Mrs. Whitman's outburst had done nothing to strengthen her case, but had instead exposed the depths of her own emotional turmoil. Now it was up to Judge Carter to sift through the remaining facts and deliver a fair and just verdict. As the courtroom settled after Mrs. Whitman's dramatic exit, Judge Carter's voice filled the silence. His words were deliberate and measured as he began the final stages of the trial. He had spent hours listening to testimonies, weighing the evidence, and considering the various factors that played into the case. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, Judge Carter began, his gaze shifting between the two parties. "This court finds that the accusations against Mr. James Wilson are unsubstantiated. There is no concrete proof that he stole any items from Mrs. Whitman's home. The witness testimonies have been conflicting, and the claims made by Mrs. Whitman have not been supported by facts." James's breath caught in his chest. The tension that had been suffocating him throughout the trial began to lift but he remained still, waiting for the final declaration. His hands, once tightly clenched, now relaxed at his sides. Furthermore, Judge Carter continued, his voice calm but firm, Mrs. Whitman's actions in this courtroom, including her outbursts and baseless accusations, have only served to undermine her credibility. It is clear that her judgment has been clouded by emotions rather than objective reasoning. James's heart pounded in his chest, but the words that followed brought him a sense of release. Therefore, this court finds Mr. Wilson not guilty of theft. A wave of relief washed over James. His composure remained intact, but his face betrayed the emotions he had been holding back. He had feared the worst, but now he was vindicated. "Thank you, Your Honor," James said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I've worked hard to build my reputation, and I just want to do my job and live my life without being judged for things I haven't done." Judge Carter nodded, a small but meaningful gesture of acknowledgement. "Mr. Wilson," he replied, "your patience, composure, and honesty throughout this trial have been commendable. Let this case serve as a reminder that we must always rely on facts and evidence, not assumptions or prejudices." The courtroom, once tense and divided, erupted into applause. It was a rare moment of unity, a moment when justice had prevailed. James walked out of the courtroom with his head held high, a symbol of resilience and dignity. Outside, the crisp air greeted him like a fresh start. The weight of the trial had lifted, and though the journey had been difficult, he now felt a renewed sense of hope for the future. He could finally move forward, knowing that the truth had been heard and that justice had been served. As James took his first steps into the world beyond the courthouse, he knew that this experience would stay with him, a reminder of the importance of fairness, integrity, and the strength to stand firm in the face of adversity. As the tension in the courtroom slowly dissipated, the judge regained his composure, his voice steady and unwavering. Let this moment be a reminder that justice is not swayed by emotion or spectacle, but by truth and reason. The room, once charged with chaos, now fell into a heavy silence. Mrs. Whitman, though defeated, had shown the world the lengths to which frustration and desperation could drive a person. James Wilson stood tall, his innocence proven, but the scars of the trial would remain with him forever. With the final gavel strike, the case was closed, and the courtroom filed out, leaving behind a story that would linger in the minds of all who witnessed it. If you enjoyed this intense courtroom drama, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more gripping tales and riveting stories. Stay tuned, and thank you for being part of this journey.